No problem. I will just look through and make sure we got everything. And there we go.
All right, so we can start recording. Welcome, everyone. This is our biweekly BSIC webinar dedicated today to the future of work. My name is Vanessa Grellet. I'm the president of the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, and I'm happy to welcome today Jeff Wald, entrepreneur extraordinaire and author of The End of Jobs, the Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations. So Jeff is going to do today a presentation for around 20 minutes, and then we'll dive into Q&As. In the meantime, feel free to put your questions in the chat. Either we'll take them immediately during the presentation and make it a little bit conversational, or we'll take it at the end of the presentation and start the dialogue. So just by way of background, a little bit on to set the scene, the world has seen three technological revolutions, right? Mechanization, electrification, and computerization. And although these led to increases in productivity, they also led to renewing balance and the power balance between companies and workers. And this power balance shifted heavily towards the companies. We are now in the fourth industrial revolution, powered by data, AI, and robots. And we're wondering what will be the consequences of these innovations on the future of work. Usually the future of work, you've seen the debate, focus on machines replacing humans and how we manage that transition. And recently we've seen with the pandemic that a lot of the companies are focusing on worker well-being and remote work. So with us today, Jeff Wald is going to present his book and his idea on what the future of work is. By way of background, Jeff Wald is the founder of WorkMarket, a software platform that enables companies to manage freelancers, which was sold to ADP recently. Jeff has founded several other technology companies, including Spinback, a social sharing platform, which was sold to Salesforce subsequently. And Jeff began his career in finance as a managing director and activist in an activist hedge fund called Barrington Capital Group, a VP at a venture capital firm called Glenrock, and held various roles in the M&A group of JP Morgan. Currently, Jeff is an active angel investor and startup advisor. He serves on numerous public and private boards, and Jeff holds an MBA from Harvard University and an MS and BS from Cornell University. So Jeff, welcome. I leave now the floor to you and to your presentation.
Well, thank you so much for Vanessa. Thank you to everybody for joining. As Vanessa talked about, we're going to do a brief overview of the research that is resident in the book. So the book just came out about 6 weeks ago, The End of Jobs, Rise of On-Demand Workers and Agile Corporations. We've been fortunate enough to hit #1 in all of Amazon's HR categories for a little while. And it's been great. So, look, this is your time. As Vanessa said, I'm going to go through this presentation much quicker than normal. We're going to go through a brief history of work. We're going to talk a little bit about the world of work today, near term and future. But this is your time. So think about what you want to learn about the future of work or questions you may have, because I always love if people challenge the different conclusions that I've drawn or have different data sources I haven't seen. And this group, I am sure, knows a lot more about some of these subjects than I do. So diving in. Certainly, as we think about trying to predict the future of work, we need to think about how the world of work has evolved and how we got here. As Vanessa highlighted, there have been 3 industrial revolutions. It's important to study them because we are at the early stages of what some people call the 4th industrial revolution. In the book, I actually call it the first services revolution, and go into some depth about why that is. But as you think about the history of work, the way I like to think about it and the framework I like to set up is this power balance between companies and workers. And you can think about the history of work as this undulating balance of power between these two forces, where power moves to companies workers struggle, and then regulation, safety nets, and unions help workers gain some semblance of balance, but the relationship is never fully in balance. And the times that we see the relationship get the most out of balance is when huge increases in productivity are able to be wrought from new technological advancements. Mechanization, the movement of hand power to machine power. Electrification, the flowing of electric power into those machines, driving efficiency. And then computerization, the creation of an entire digital world. And the robots and AI stand as this either fourth industrial revolution or first services revolution, which will drive so much productivity increase that we will see, and are beginning to see already, the power balance shift again massively to companies. And so what do workers do? Historically, they've relied on regulation, safety net, and unions, and we're going to talk a little bit in our last section about the state of those things today. And so clearly, not only does the future of work depend on the history of work, it depends on where we are today. And this is the end of jobs to me. So the end of jobs was not meant to say that jobs are going to go because of robots, because of AI. It was meant to highlight the fact that the job that we knew, one boss, one office, 9 to 5, that job is ending. It is being replaced slowly, although COVID is speeding this up, and it's speeding up a host of things that are impacting the future of work, but it is being replaced by the fluid, team-based, work from anywhere, always on job. And so that is the job that is ending. That is the point of the title of the book, is we are moving from one boss, one office, 9 to 5, to fluid, team-based, always on, work from anywhere. And the HCM software packages, the policies and procedures in the office, how you are reviewed, the types of work that you do, all of these things are impacted by this change. The biggest impact and the most present one is that work from anywhere. That is the one that COVID is clearly causing the biggest acceleration. So, as with all things, we should start with data. Prior to this pandemic, 3% of the workforce worked remotely. And the definition of remote work is super important here. Remote work means more than 50% of the time you are not in an office, which is to say the office doesn't have a permanent office for you or a permanent desk, you hotel or things like that. It is to say that from a tax nexus standpoint, your tax nexus is not in that office location. It is usually your home location. And that becomes very important later. But everything pre-pandemic said to us that remote workers were more productive, they were more engaged, they had a higher retention rate, they cost the company less, and they cost the worker less, that the workers themselves were less stressed, that they were happier, they were healthier. That is what every piece of data would tell us. And yet, we only had 3% of the workforce working remotely. And there were two huge impediments to that. First was a mindset impediment. We all have had the boss or are that boss that have said, yeah, I get all that, but I think everyone should be in the office. I think magic happens when everyone's together. I think productivity, presence equals productivity. And I will tell you, having met with many CEOs to discuss these topics, that's a very hard thing to argue against. I will say, all right, well, here's all the data. And your counter argument is, you just think? And they would say, yeah, I just think that. I'm like, I don't know how to debate this with you. There's no counterpoint to the I think. The second impediment was that companies lacked the policies, the procedures, and the infrastructure to allow remote work at scale. The policies and the procedures don't just mean you can work from home every now and again. They mean when you're working from home, how are you integrating? Are we using project management software so we can be very clear about where everybody is? Do we have protocols about allowing for remote meetings and for people to dial in? Does that mean that everyone's got to be on camera, not on camera? The infrastructure, I think most people can understand pretty quickly. Being able to access systems from a remote location creates a whole host of security concerns. Zoom bombing, by the way, is the least of the cybersecurity concerns that will come out of this era in the world of work. The hack on Twitter yesterday is just the tip of the iceberg of what you're going to see from a cybersecurity standpoint. But regardless, during the pandemic, in April and May at its height, we had about 40% of the US workforce working remotely. It is important to remember that 42% is the natural limit. That is, if every single person working remote was working remote, 42% is what we could do, because clearly people in retail, in transportation, in hospitality, entertainment, manufacturing, and a host of other industries cannot work remotely. The United States actually has the highest percentage of its labor force that can work remotely. Pre the pandemic, we would have predicted, those of us that predict the future of work, that about 4% of the workforce will be remote over the next 20 years. We would move from 3% to 4%. And the reason for that is because of those impediments, the mindset impediment, the infrastructure, policies, and procedure impediment. Both of those things had to change. This is the perfect example, which is why we're double clicking on this one, of how COVID is impacting and speeding up the future of work. The mindset had to change. You didn't have a choice. People couldn't be in the office. And the infrastructure, policies, and procedures had to be put in place as imperfectly as they were put in place. They had to be put in place. And now people are starting to see the benefit, which is why when we start to look job function by job function, I would make the prediction that we will, post-pandemic, and God willing, that is a time we achieve soon as a society, post-pandemic, we will settle at 8% of the workforce working remotely. Again, remember, remotely means more than 50% of the time not in the office. I think about 30% of the workforce will move to a more flexible work arrangement, meaning every now and again they will work from home, because what did work from home mean pre-pandemic? What did you all think when Steve said, hey, I'm going to work from home tomorrow? You all thought, oh, that's adorable. Steve's going to the beach. He's not going to do anything. Now, if somebody were to say to you, if you're back in your offices, as some people already are, hey, I'm going to work from home tomorrow. Now, what do you think? You think, oh, well, no, he's really going to get some work done. So there has been a mind shift change, and the flexible work change will be huge. The remote workforce movement will also be huge, just not as huge as some people would think. The last thing we want to talk about when we talk about the world of work today is this notion of the end of jobs, what it means, because some people lament, they say, oh, you know, things aren't like they used to be. And for some reason, everyone points to IBM. I don't know why IBM is always the company people point to. People say, you know, in the 1960s, everyone worked at IBM for 40 years and they marched towards their gold watch. And they had a defined benefit pension plan, and the company looked after them and they looked after the company. And I would say, oh, okay, that's interesting. And I think to myself, okay, I mean, I didn't have the benefit of being alive then, and the data we have is not that robust, certainly not nearly as robust as the data stores we have now. But here's what we do know. We know the average length of a job today is 4.2 years. Does anybody want to take a guess in the chat as to what that was in 1960? In 1960, in the United States of America, people jump in, take some sort of guess. I don't see the chat here. Do we have a chat? Oh, we do have a chat. Boom.
Is everyone able to go in the chat?
You have to go to your more function in the thing, but. So Alana took a guess at 10 years. So at the height of the lifetime employment contract, anyone else can free to jump in with a guess. The person with it is the closest or gets this guess correctly, I will send a free signed copy of the book to. Ooh, added incentive. Oh, now Murad's jumping in 25. Oh, now they're coming 15 years. Oh, the free book. That's what got you guys jumping in the chat. The height of the lifetime employment contract in 1960. 5 years. That was the guess. That is the answer to the question. Sorry, that's not the guess. That is the answer, 5 years. And so it's interesting. That is not to say that lifetime employment didn't, we're gonna have another guessing game in a moment. That is not to say the lifetime employment didn't exist. It's not to say the lifetime employment contract didn't exist. But to pretend that that was the reality for the vast majority of workers is just a fallacy. Did it exist for some workers at some companies? Of course it did. But did it exist system-wide? Not remotely. So to hearken back to a job that really never existed, it's something to be very careful about. So we're not going to move into on-demand labor. We'll touch on some of that maybe in Q&A, and we're just going to move right to the robots because we only have a few more minutes. Let's talk a little bit about these robots and the coming doom of mankind that many people predict. And as with every of the previous technological step functions, there are reports that people quote and say, oh, McKinsey says 50% of jobs are going to go. Oxford University predicts 47% of jobs are going to go. And that is what happened every single time before each technological step function. Everyone said, oh my God, now that there's weaving looms, now that there's an assembly line, we won't have any more jobs. And as you all know from your history, that never turned out to be true. We ended up with ever more jobs at an ever higher standard of living. That is not to pretend that transitions were not easy. Jobs were lost, but more jobs were created. And so people point now to the McKinsey study, the Oxford University study, PwC did a big study that people quote. And it's important to note that everyone that quotes those studies that I've seen quotes them incorrectly. Read those studies. Those studies do not say, the McKinsey study does not say 50% of jobs are going to go in the next 20 years. They say 50% of jobs are susceptible to potentially being displaced from automation. And so we'll talk about those again in a moment. The first robots came to be in about the late 1970s, industrial automation, car manufacturing specifically. They were arms that reached out from a pole. Those arms could do three things. They could paint, they could weld, and they could pick something up. That was enough to start displacing a tremendous number of jobs in the manufacturing sector. In the United States, manufacturing employment peaked at 20 million in 1980, and it settled down about 20 years later at about 12 million. 40% of manufacturing jobs in the United States left. They left not because of trade policy predominantly, not because of environmental policy. They left because robots were doing the work. We produce about twice as much from an industrial goods manufacturing standpoint as we did in 1980. We just do so with fewer workers. Now, people get concerned because robots are getting smarter, they're getting more agile, and they're getting cheaper. They are no longer just an arm coming off of a manufacturing line. They can do more and more things. Certainly AI has had two false dawns before, but now it's having a new birth, and it may well work this time, although AI investment has started to massively curtail, and HR and C-suites are starting to say, this is not what we thought it was going to be. We're not seeing that big of a pickup. So we may have another false dawn of AI. But robots and AI are getting more intelligent, smarter. They are getting more agile, and they are getting cheaper. And while that is true, those of us that have had the opportunity to go to the Boston Dynamics labs and play with their robot dogs, and you've all seen the videos of them doing backflips and running upstairs, it's amazing. But it is important to remember that while robots are getting smarter, are getting more agile, are getting cheaper, they remain incredibly expensive, incredibly clumsy, and incredibly dumb. The idea that you're going to have Rosie Jetson in your living room cooking your food and cleaning is literally laughable. There is no world in the next 20 to 30 years where that can occur. That said, there are 17 million robots on the earth today. 15 million of them are vacuum cleaners. 2.1 million industrial robots exist in warehouses and manufacturing lines around the world today. The growth is about 10 to 15% a year in their population. So while robots may continue their evolution and get smarter and cheaper and more capable, there is no near-term concern. What we should think about in the near term are the in-depth studies that have been done by Oxford, by McKinsey. The World Economic Forum, I would say, has the best. If you're going to read one thing about the future of work, well, if you're going to read one thing, you should read my book. If you're going to read one thing, if you're going to read two things, go to the World Economic Forum and get their paper written about 1.5 years ago on the future of work. It is by far the most intelligent look. I have an opportunity to sit on their advisory board on the future of work. I had nothing to do with this paper. And they would tell you that there will be a net increase in jobs because of automation and robots over the next 5 years. They only do a 5-year look. But when you start looking at those things, you start to see that when we make predictions on job losses, the predictions need to be made on the component tasks of a job. There are basically 704 different classifications of work. We can look at those classifications and see how much of their component tasks are repetitive high volume tasks. If it is more than 50%, that job is at risk. Doesn't mean it's going to go, it just means it's at risk. If it's more than 75%, it is going to go. It is not going to go completely, but there will be very few jobs that do that function anymore. However, so all of that math, by the way, yields about 10 to 15% of jobs lost. That is upwards of 25 million jobs in the United States. That is a lot. However, we will increase jobs in other fields. Clearly in robotics and data and AI and programming, of course, there will be new jobs in fields we never even thought about, but jobs in HR, in sales, in marketing, in customer support, jobs that require human interaction, empathy, creativity, design, all of those jobs are expected to expand. The real doom of mankind is not robots taking jobs. It is that we do not do the retraining for the 10 to 15% of people that lose their jobs in areas like retail and transportation and basic data entry and administrative. We do not do the retraining of those people necessary so that they can take the jobs that are growing, because we have done a very poor job of this. And if we do not do that, we will exacerbate the existing gaps in society, and that will make for a very difficult transition. That said, the things that augment workers, as they will lose a lot of bargaining power in our balance of power framework, the social safety net, regulation, the union movement, all of them are at historic low points. The social safety net has never been closer to bankruptcy. The regulatory framework in the United States, at least, is at a huge rollback given the current administration. And the union movement is at its lowest level of penetration. About 7% of US workers belong to unions. That is down from 30% in the post-World War II era. And so unions are at their weakest. But what gives us hope are things like the expansion of the social safety net that we saw in the CARES Act. We can talk about that if you'd like. We can see that while the federal government has stepped back, some states have stepped into the breach and are moving the regulatory environment forward, whether that's on worker classification like California's AB 5, or on environmental and emissions like California's laws again, and it's more states than just California. And for things like the union movement, the Fight for 15 is a great example of a grassroots activist-driven campaign that was not union-led. It was started by the union. It was started by the SEIU out of Seattle. A guy named David Rolfe and his team out there started this campaign, but the campaign was picked up nationwide by mostly non-union workers, and it has led to 17 states creating a threshold where they are slowly stepping their minimum wage up to $15 an hour. New York being one of those states. So I will leave you with the ATM paradox. It is my favorite example because it highlights a host of things that we just talked about. So, and it's our next trivia question. In 1995, two things happened. One, employment in bank tellers hit 500,000, and two, the proliferation of the ATM hit its saturation. Every single bank branch had an ATM. 25 years later, today, how many bank tellers do you think are employed in the United States? Feel free to start guessing. Again, free book to whoever is the most correct. So here is the dynamic. Here's what happened. Every single person predicting jobs predicted in 1995, well, that's the end of bank teller employment. And they thought that because the bank teller job involves a host of things, right? It involves a host of repetitive high volume tasks, taking in cash, giving out cash. And so it does stand to reason that, wow, that job has a lot of its component tasks. And that is correct, but it is not 75% of their tasks. And so the repetitive high volume task of taking cash in and giving cash out moved to a robot into what we call a cobot scenario, where the robot does the mundane repetitive high volume task and the human steps out from behind the plexiglass in the bank teller example, has an iPad now and says, well, let me upsell you on a mortgage or a loan product, an automotive loan, or one of our investment products. They give you a higher level of customer service. Welcome to Chase. How can I help you today? And so it was a cobot scenario. And so people said, wow, look at that. This is a great example of cobots, because bank teller employment in the United States today is 600,000. There are 20% more bank tellers. And so people point to that example and they say, wow, everybody's just dead wrong. You know, robots aren't going to take jobs. No, I wouldn't draw that conclusion. And they point to the increase and they say, oh, look, this is clearly an example of cobots, and robots are going to be great for everything and nobody has anything to worry about in regards to their job. No, I wouldn't draw that conclusion either. The power of this example is to show the complexity of workforce resource planning, because the biggest variable in the equation of bank teller employment in the United States was not the efficiency of the tellers. It wasn't the ATM. It wasn't mobile banking. It was banking deregulation that occurred in the United States. First with the Glass-Steagall Act being removed, then a host of other banking deregulation actions that occurred that allowed banks to massively increase their branch networks and compete in places they couldn't compete before. And now here in Manhattan, there's a bank branch on every corner, sometimes two. The number of bank branches in the United States doubled. The number of tellers per branch went from 21 on average to 13, because I did need fewer tellers because the ATM could handle more and more. And so the point of the example is just to say that anytime you have somebody that draws a simple conclusion that says, oh, well, because of this, all of that is going to happen, just be careful, because it belays the complexity of labor force planning involving that technology, in this example, the ATM, other technologies like online banking and mobile banking. It involves the teller job and customer service and what level of customer service you want to have. It involves the competitive environment. If Chase has got tellers greeting everybody saying hello, as Bank of America, do I want to have nobody greeting them and saying hello? And it involves the regulatory framework, not just on the regulation of employment, but a host of other regulatory components and a host of other factors. And so be mindful when anybody makes predictions that are too broad, that are too simplistic. The history of work, the data of work, how companies actually engage employees would all tell us that it is incredibly complex and that huge movements very rarely occur in the world of labor. And so with that, I will tell you that I will leave you with predicting the future of work is super, super hard. Predicting the future of anything is super, super hard. But especially with the world of work, especially with some of the people on the phone today, we may not be able to predict it so well, but we do get to create it. The most important way we get to create it is we have the right to elect the men and women that create the regulatory environment in which all this occurs. Create the regulatory environment in which unions may grow again and be more active, or some other loose confederation can be more active, like the Fight for 15, that create the social safety net, that provide maybe that retraining or force companies to do the training or adjust the education system to do the training necessary for all of those workers that will be displaced. We get to create this future. And so thank you for your attention. And now I will stop sharing and we will move to questions.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Great presentation, but I don't think I got the final answer of the tellers. So we want to know who won the book.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it said 600,000. There are 600,000 bank tellers in the United States today.
Would you be willing to give a bid
So
to the
none of
person
you.
who was closer to that
Of
number?
course.
All
Of
right.
course. Was it you? Is that why? Is it you?
No, we have Kelly Chappell at 400K.
Kelly, if you will send Vanessa your information, and I will send you a signed copy of the book. And then the same is true, I guess, for the first question, whoever's closest there. I will send you guys signed copies of the book because ADP was kind enough to buy a few thousand of them. So we will
So
send a few to your way.
okay, we'll find who is that person. I'll reach out to them.
Of course.
I had a question, a follow-up question. You said you didn't have time to speak about the on-demand market, but there's a lot of developers in our communities, and I think it would be interesting for us to
Sure.
just get, shed a little, if you could shed a little bit of light on that and how you've seen the transformation in the industry.
I will shed as much light as any one person can shed. So, as Vanessa said at the beginning, WorkMarket is enterprise software that enables corporations to manage their on-demand labor. And we are the largest piece of software in the world to do that. We, raised a ton of money from SoftBank and Union Square to build the company. ADP bought us. And so now we're a part of the largest HR company on the planet. And it is important to understand data. As I hope you guys have appreciated, we like to start with data. The on-demand market is about 25 to 30% of the labor force. The reason that we don't know exactly the size of the labor force is that even though our software is out there and there are now other software systems out there, the majority, nearly 60% by our estimate, is untracked. That is the largest answer in every single survey of CHROs, of procurement managers, of service managers, when asked the question, how many freelancers do you use? How many temps do you use? Who manages it? What system manages it? The number one answer in all those questions is, I don't know. I don't know how many freelancers we use. I don't know how many temps we use. So we do our best to estimate. And the estimates come from a bunch of longitudinal studies that have been done by some great companies. ADP's Research Institute put out by far the most in-depth study, because every other means of getting this data, because the data is so disparate, are surveys, and surveys are historically inaccurate in the labor world, especially surveys with a small sample size, as most of these are. I mean, it's tough to do a survey of 5,000 people and then extrapolate out to a workforce of 160 million, but they're decent, and because they're longitudinal, we can see how they trend over time. But ADP is the largest issuer of 1099s, partially through our platform. We have more data points on the on-demand workforce, and we would tell you that, again, about 25% of the labor force, and it's grown slowly over the last 10 years. When I started WorkMarket, there was this general notion in the world of work that by 2020, 50% of the labor force was going to be on demand. Now, I am guilty of using that in my investor decks. I mean, I had to raise tens of millions of dollars to build WorkMarket, and showing a big statistic that was pushing the market forward was always a good thing. But deep down, I didn't think that was ever going to happen. It wasn't going to happen because labor statistics don't move that quickly, because corporate decision-making doesn't show that there was going to be a huge engagement point of on-demand workers, and all the reasons that we talked about. So on-demand, according to every single study, has done one of three things. It has slightly grown over the last 10 years from 25% to maybe 26, 27, or if it was 28, it's grown to 29 or 30. Again, we don't know. It's somewhere in that band. It has either slightly grown, it has stayed the same size, which is what the longest dated study, they've been doing the same survey for 10 years, would say it's about the same size as it was, and their number is 27%, or it shrunk. That's what the Bureau of Labor Statistics would tell us. They would say over the last 15 years, the on-demand market has shrunk. And I will tell you that there is a battle for the on-demand market soul going on right now. The battle on one side is the CFO, the COO, the C-suite of a company saying, if we use more on-demand workers, we can have an agile corporation. We can be more flexible. Labor is by far the largest cost of almost every company on the planet. And if we can turn that cost from more of a fixed cost right now into more of a variable cost, we'll be better off. That is one notion that is pushing more companies to use a more on-demand labor. On the other side of that is the regulatory environment. California's AB5 law and a host of other things are pushing people to say, oh, I don't think we should use any freelancers or temps. And I will tell you this, in the thousands of meetings I have had with C-suite executives to try to sell them WorkMarket, I have never once heard anybody say, hey, we're going to convert our W-2s to 1099s, or we're going to get rid of our W-2s and start engaging a bunch of 1099s. I've never heard anybody say that. Nobody has gotten rid of W-2s and engaged on-demand workers. I have heard many times companies say, hey, we are getting uncomfortable with our usage of freelancers and temps, and so we are going to convert them all to W-2s. This is all obviously US labor classifications. I've heard that a lot. Companies getting very uncomfortable that they're running too much regulatory risk, worker misclassification risk, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, and a host of other things. That I've heard a lot. And so it's important to understand the data. It's important to understand the different trends that are going on. And it's important to understand that even if every company had no regulatory concern whatsoever, let's say the government came out and said, everyone do what you want, we don't care anymore, which is basically what the Trump administration has said. But let's leave that aside for a second. Even in that context, the business process, the work, wouldn't allow for much more than 40% of the US workforce to go fully on demand. So I would argue that's the natural limit. We have a lot of work and a lot of research by the BLS and my team at ADP that have gone into this. I would say that's the natural limit. You can get about 40%, maybe it's 42, it's somewhere, but it's not much more than that, right? You will never have an on-demand workforce in a manufacturing environment. You just won't do it. It just doesn't make any sense. And so those are some things to think about as you think about the on-demand workforce, that it is a very large part of the labor force, but it has been for a very long time. It is, if it is growing, it is growing very slowly, but the future of on-demand labor, I think, is going to be more driven by the regulatory environment, and I think it will shrink. And that on-demand labor is one component of how people do their resource planning, and every company is aware of it, and they have not moved to it. And if they could, they would probably get to 40%.
So Jeff, there's a few questions in the chat. So if that on-demand were to move, or remote working be more accepted and people shift to different types of jobs, will you think that would lead to an erosion of workers' rights? So there's the perception, and it might be true, I'm not an expert, that if you're an on-demand worker, you're not going to have the benefits as a W-2, you're not going to have your retirement, you're not going to have the same healthcare system, at least in the US. Where do you see that trend with the on-demand workers, and how can they do something about it? Or is your argument only the government can do something about it?
So this is a great question that encompasses a host of different things in the world of labor. And let me answer with a few data points that I know, and then just some things I think. So here's what I know. In every single survey, McKinsey's survey, the Freelancers Union survey, and a host of other companies that, again, run these surveys year in and year out, 80% of on-demand workers would not take a full-time job if offered. They like being an on-demand worker. Now, all of those surveys, by the way, were taken during an economic expansion. I don't know what the answer would be right now. Very different economic environment. So, but we have to accept that as data. That is a data point. The trend that I know that is clear, and one of the things, and in one of the major theses in the book, I mean, the book is titled The Rise of On-Demand Workers. And in the book, I make the point that that is not to say that we're all going to be on-demand workers. The reason that that is the subtitle is that everything that the on-demand worker faces, including total personal responsibility, right? That on-demand worker is in charge of their own training, their development, their healthcare, their retirement, their unemployment insurance, right? They don't get unemployment insurance. They have to save themselves. All of those things are starting to permeate the full-time workforce. So let me be more clear. Total personal responsibility, task-based labor, data-driven HR, algorithms allocating work, work from anywhere, and always on. Those 6 tenets of being an on-demand worker. As an Uber driver, I know that I have total personal responsibility. Uber's not giving me anything for my healthcare or my retirement. Uber's not providing me training. Uber's not marketing my skills to another employer, right? I know that. I know that Uber is going to allocate my jobs via an algorithm. I know that all of the data, not just the 5-star ratings that you maybe or maybe not give me, but also how responsive I was to a job, how quickly I got something done. A host of other parameters are being tracked by Uber's algorithms to see whether or not to allocate that next rider to that driver. I know that I do work on a task basis. I know that I work remotely. I'm not going to Uber's offices. I know that I don't close my job at 5. I work when I can work, when I want to work, when I need to work. All of those things are permeating the full-time labor force. The defined benefit pension plan became the defined contribution pension plan, became the 401k with a match, became a 401k with less match. Healthcare costs are being pushed more and more onto workers. Companies used to have universities where they'd send everybody for training. Almost every company I know that had a university has closed it down over the last decade. And now, to pick on our friends at IBM again, who used to have IBM University, now at IBM, you have to provide 40 hours of online training on your own time. It is no longer 2 weeks at IBM University where you get to learn all the new stuff. Do it on your own time. That's the evolution of the full-time worker, is that they are facing more and more of the challenges and the dynamics of the on-demand worker. And so this convergence between those two, that is what, to me, is the rise of on-demand workers. That is why that is being driven in some cases by the 4th Industrial Revolution, because companies have more and more bargaining power in this relationship. The solution to that, Vanessa, I don't know. I would say the solution to that is we need to fix our political process so we put the men and women in the room that are going to be thinking about putting together a framework of regulation that works for workers in the 21st century, because the way we do things in the United States is all kinds of fucked up. Sorry for the language.
And so do you feel that, I mean, before COVID, there was increased competition, at least let's put it in the tech space, where you and other types of companies, where companies were actually fighting for talent and increasing those workers' rights and benefits. Would you say that applies only to a really small portion of the population?
It does apply to a very small portion of the population. It is one of those instances, and we see it throughout the history of work, where people with specialized skills in a specific geography sometimes, they get the bargaining power. The balance of power massively shifts to them. Try hiring a cybersecurity person right now. You can't. You can't hire them full time. They actually will almost always work on demand. They'll say, yeah, I'll do a gig for you. I'll do a project for you. I'll come in and work on your stuff. For 6 months, you're going to pay me an exorbitant amount of money, and then I'm going to go and I'm going to work on someone else's project, and I'm going to work from the beach. I'll be in your office once or twice. That's it. That is a power balance. That is the balance of power within a specific geo, within a specific skill set that massively tips to workers. So when the power resides with companies, companies tend to disadvantage workers, take away some of the corporate safety net, and drive bargaining power. When the power balance shifts, and I talk about this a lot in the book, workers tend to go on demand. They tend to say, well, I'll work when I want, how I want. You won't tell me where I'll be. I'm not coming to your stupid company meetings. I'm not wasting my time with this and that. And so that is a great example of exactly that, but they are usually short-lived. History would tell us that those advantages are short-lived. As the education system and the capitalist system, if there's a scarce resource, that resource is getting a lot, people want to go there, so more people train, and then the price harmonizes. It is just supply and demand that drives the majority of this power balance.
Another question from the chat. Do you have examples of other countries who are doing better in on-demand labor than others compared to the US or other countries?
It is a great question. It's one I struggled with a lot when doing the book because I wanted to give a more global perspective, but I will say there are a lot of things the US government does incredibly well. One of them is the IRS. The IRS is the most technologically advanced by a country mile of revenue authorities around the world. So they had a lot more data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had a lot more data, and ADP's Research Institute had a lot more data on US companies than on other countries. I will say that the on-demand market in the EU is about the same size as in the US, but it is massively tipped towards temps, whereas the US is more tipped towards freelancers. But I did not have access to a lot of data, and certainly not data on the scale, and certainly not data on a historic perspective, the way I had access to data in the United States. So the book is very US centric.
All right. Another question from Santosh. How do you foresee employment unbundling and gig economy intersect?
Say the question again, please.
It's in the chat. How would you foresee employment unbundling and gig economy intersect? Santosh, if you're still here,
so
more color on your question.
Well, I'll take a crack, and then Santosh, let me know if I'm being responsive. I think that the two will definitely intersect at some point, but it's important to understand, and again, sorry I keep saying this, but we go into, in the book, what I call the labor equation. There's this general notion amongst people that debate work, especially those that debate it from the sidelines, that companies just want to engage the cheapest worker, and on-demand workers are the cheapest worker. No, that is not correct on a number of fronts. Companies certainly have cost as one of the variables in their resource labor planning process. But so is ramp up time, so is the length of the job, so is the complexity and the interaction with the rest of the company, so is the institutional knowledge and intellectual property the job touches, so is the competitive environment, so is the regulatory environment. There are about 15 different variables in that equation, and cost is one, and it's a powerful one. And so the idea that companies are just going to say, oh, well, now that we can use more on-demand workers, we're going to, that may be true. I just have zero data to support that. Zero anecdotal and zero hard data to support that. I've never seen a company do it and whatever. The other side of that is the idea that on-demand labor is cheaper. It is not. There are two parts of on-demand labor. One is a temp and one is a freelancer. To engage a temp, you are still paying the prevailing wage rate for that job, whatever it's $15 an hour, $20 an hour, whatever it is. And on top of that, you're paying the VIG to the staffing firm that does the payrolling for you. In doing that, in paying an incremental 15% on average, that is not their benefits, that is just the 15% you pay the staffing firm. Sometimes it's less because you brought them the person, sometimes it's more because they found the person for you. You do that because you can then just call the staffing firm and say, hey, don't send us those 100 people tomorrow. We're good. Project is over. And you don't have to worry about severance, the Harm Act, and a host of other things for those workers. But those workers are still getting benefits. They are still have to pay Social Security and unemployment tax. They get a W-2. So they are more expensive, but you're getting the variability of being able to turn them off very quickly and turn them on. The freelancer, on average, charges a higher hourly rate. Whatever the prevailing wage rate is, 20 bucks an hour, the freelancer not only incorporates the fact that they have benefits that they have to buy themselves, that they have to pay unincorporated income tax, with Social Security and a host of other things, but the fact that they know that they're going to work for fewer hours and they usually have a higher skill set. That is usually the case in the freelance market. So the average wage rate of a freelancer across every industry, across every geo, is about 35% higher. About 25% of that are the benefits, because when people talk about a wage rate, they don't incorporate a fully loaded wage rate. They just say, oh, you pay 20 bucks an hour. But we all know that if you pay an employee 20 bucks an hour, your all-in cost is 25% higher. So The freelancer is 35% more expensive on an hourly basis. The data would tell us. I'm sure everyone has examples where that's not true, but the data system-wide would tell us that. But a freelancer, on average, is engaged 60% less than a full-time employee, 60% fewer hours, because the average employee in the service industry, which is where most freelancers are engaged, the average employee is utilized 60% of the time. And so I'm paying less for my full-time employee, but I have to pay him for every single hour. I pay more for the freelancer, but I only pay the freelancer for the hours I use. And so that's the data in the freelance market. So is that to say that as companies start gaining more power, that they're going to decrease the corporate safety net? Yes, that is to say that. Is that to say that more of the workers are going to face the tensions of the on-demand market, task-based labor, data-driven HR, algorithms allocating work? Yes. I do not think that that means that companies then turn and say, well, then screw it, let's just make everybody a freelancer or a temp. I would argue against that. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I have another question. Let's say I'm graduating today from college, or, just I'm an 18-year-old and I want to prepare for the future. What should I be thinking about in careers that become longer and longer as our lifespan increases, as we become more agile? What skills should I invest in? How should I position myself? What should I be thinking about?
Software programming. Oh, should I give you more? I'll give you a longer answer than that. But that is what I tell my nieces and nephews. I'm like, y'all need to learn how to code. One of them wants to be an actor. I'm like, stop it. And so software programming, the unemployment rate for developers in New York City, I obviously don't know what it is over the last few months, but pre-COVID, it was 0%. Wasn't not a single day where my 150 developers did not get a job offer. All of them. It was maddening. So I will say this. This is the thing that I asked every single person that I interviewed for the book, and I was able to interview hundreds of people that are shaping the future of work. I asked them all actually that question, Vanessa, because it's a great question. It's a great question to ask. What advice would you give? This is the way I framed it. What advice would you give to someone that is just about to enter the labor force? And I will tell you, every single answer was basically the same. I'm going to say it in a much more verbose way, but they basically said this. We used to have a model where from 18 to about 24, you would get all of the skills training you needed to monetize through an entire career, right? The monetization period for that skill, those skills broadly that you learn from 18 to 24 would last 30 years. The amount of time in which skills diminish has massively compressed. And this is obviously, we are moving from art now and not science. Our estimates, based on conversations with people that are investing in education, people in HR, our best estimate right now is that the skills diminishment rate is now about 4 years. That in about 4 years, everything you learned is no longer relevant in most industries. Obviously, there are exceptions. And so the answer that everybody gave was basically the only constant is change, and you have to become a lifelong learner because your skills are going to diminish very quickly. And so always be learning, always be gaining new skills. And so that was basically the answer. But that being said, well, you're on mute, first of all, but that being said, software.
Yeah. And on the flip side, what should companies be thinking about in order to be successful with their workforce? How should they be planning, thinking about, the next 20 years strategically, basically?
So this is another great question. This is something we talk about a lot. Most of the conversations I have are with CHROs and C-suite executives to talk about, well, what do we do about the future of work? And I will basically walk them through a series of things. I will first say, have you systematized every piece of labor? This goes back to our 60% of on-demand work is unaccounted for. If you do not have every labor asset in a system, you're behind. Mostly I'll say that to help sell WorkMarket software, but even if they don't use WorkMarket, they should use a system. If you have systems, great. You are not behind, but you're not ahead. To be ahead of the future of work, you need to have those systems talk to each other. You need to integrate those systems so that all your labor resources are in one system. Now, if you've done that, you're ahead of the game, because where the world is going is something in the book we call total talent management. The idea that all of your labor resources are in one system or a series of systems that speak to each other via API, that there is a AI layer of work allocation above that system, and above the AI layer is a project management software that is breaking work down into tasks. Those tasks are going into our AI engine and being allocated amongst full-time workers, part-time workers, freelancers, temps, vendors, robots, AI systems, drones, whatever. And then the data on those tasks is informing the next decision of the AI engine. It is looking at where you have skills gaps in real time. It is offering training to upgrade those skills, or it is sending out recruiting engines to go pull new resources in. And that is as agile as a corporation can get. That is total talent management, and that is the future of work. And it has to start with you systematizing all of your labor resources, and then putting those systems together, and then starting to overlay. And I will tell you, one of my favorite quotes in the book is, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. There are companies that do this today. This is why ADP bought WorkMarket. Our system is being stitched into ADP systems globally. And there are companies that use our work allocation engine that first looks at their ADP HCM suite to see what kind of full-time workers are available and what their skills are. And HCM systems do a terrible job of actually managing the profile of a worker. They basically know name, rank, and serial number. They don't know your skills. They don't know your projects. And so HCM systems are evolving. And then if there are no full-time workers, because you want to utilize your full-time workers first and foremost, then it starts looking into my system for what on-demand workers are there. And it is capturing data on the full-time workers, on the part-time workers, on their freelancers, and on their temps in order to understand what are their skills globally, what are their capabilities globally, in order to be able to run a more agile corporation. And there are a handful of companies doing this today.
And so I understand you interviewed a lot of people for this book, but you also launched something called the Future of Work Prize competition. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
The Future of Work Prize. So, look, it took me 6 years to write this book. And I remember calling my publisher in September of last year and said, hey, I'm done. And the publisher said, oh, are you happy with it? I was like, happy with it? No, I'm not happy with it. I'm just done. Like, I can't write another word. I'm not a good writer. This isn't my talent. That being said, you should all go buy the book. It's a great book. But one of the strokes of genius that I didn't have, someone else had, someone that was helping me with the book, is she said, well, look, why don't you get people to contribute? And I've been interviewing all of these heads of HR from major companies, heads of staffing firms, heads of labor unions, former secretaries of labor, regulators, lawyers. And I was like, I should ask them all to write what they think the world of work looks like in 2040. And I had just seen Peter Diamandis speak, the guy that had founded the X Prize. And I thought, I'll do that. And so I created the Future of Work Prize. And I recruited a bunch of people. I asked a ton of them. 40 said yes. Of the 40 that said yes, 10 had to back out because their companies wouldn't let them do it. And then another 10 really didn't make the deadline or got cut. They made the deadline, but I didn't think their piece was that great. And I took the top 20, and they're in this book. They are short essays in this book about what these men and women who are shaping the future of work, what they think the world of work looks like in 2040. And they all took a very different tact. Some of them wrote it as letters to their kids or grandkids. Some of them wrote it as a short story. Some were very data-driven. Some focus in on retirees. Some focus in on the education system. It's mind-blowing to me how great their pieces are, and I'm super fortunate they agreed to be a part of this. And so I did set aside money in a separate account, not 10 million, given that I'm not going to award it until 2040, but enough that my bankers at JP Morgan are confident it will grow to 10 million. And I will award one of the writers in the book this money in 20 years. We'll see which one of them is most correct.
And so maybe to finish off, unless there are other questions, what is your prediction for 2040?
So, it's funny. I actually wrote an essay that I was going to include in chapter 10, where I was just trying to be funny and just said there was one company left and nobody could go outside because, there was a virus or things like that. And well, anyway, so my prediction, I do go through a series of statistics and I make very specific statistical predictions that are going to be very easy to judge in 2040. Someone could just pick up the book and be like, wrong, 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 wrong. I say that the U.S. labor force will expand, and people would say, well, that doesn't seem like that great a prediction. Most other industrialized labor forces are starting to shrink. Populations are aging and people are moving out of the labor force. The US labor force is one of the few labor forces that is still increasing, although I think that may have reversed in 2020. We won't know for at least a little while. But I think the US labor force, I think the US will get back to having an immigration policy that is sensible, and we will continue to attract workers from all over the world. I think the US fertility rate will bounce back up. Right now, it has dropped, not nearly to where the EU fertility rates are, but still below the replacement rate. And so I do think that the US will have an expanded labor force of about 175 million. I do get that specific. I think the minimum wage will have moved to about $20 an hour at the federal level. Right now, at the federal level, it is $7.25. And it does take a long time for these movements to happen. When they happen quickly. I believe that the U.S. education system will have adjusted and will be a move away from four-year colleges. I think that we will have peaked at about 34% of the U.S. population having a four-year college degree or higher, and it will drop to about 30%. It obviously takes a long time for that to drop because once you get the college degree, you tend to then have it for the next 60 years. So I think it'll drop to about 30%. I think on-demand labor will have peaked at about 32% of the labor force, and then it'll start to roll back. And there are a host of other predictions that I make that I don't remember offhand.
Great.
I suppose I could just open the book and read that page because I just lay them all out. I just say, go ahead, tell me I'm wrong, because I am 100% sure that most of them are wrong. Right. But they're my best guesses based on the data, based on historic trends, and based on how companies actually engage workers.
Right. So I think there's some last comments, but no additional questions at this stage. So thank you very much. We'll reach out to the two winners of the free prize. And thank you for your time, Jeff. And thanks for everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.